Within the thick stone walls of the Tower of London, a condemned prisoner kneels before the block. The executioner raises his axe. The crowd holds its breath. In 3 seconds, everything changes, not just for the victim, but for an entire kingdom. You've heard the tower housed prisoners. You know about the ravens. But the blood-soaked truth of what happened inside those walls? That's a story your teachers never told you. For over 400 years, the Tower of London served as England's most feared execution ground. Not the public spectacle of Tyburn Hill, where common criminals met their end. No, this was where the mighty fell, where queens lost their heads, where nobles discovered that royal favor could turn lethal faster than you can say treason. The methods used here weren't just about death. They were carefully orchestrated performances of power, each one calculated to send a message that would echo through generations. Some victims died in seconds. Others, well, medieval justice had ways of making death last hours, days even. We're about to walk through every single execution method employed at the tower, from the relatively merciful swing of the headsman's axe to techniques so barbaric they'd make modern horror films look tame. Each method had its purpose, its protocol, its particular brand of agony. The tower's execution roster reads like a who's who of English history. Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, Lady Jane Grey, Thomas More. Each name represents not just a person, but a political earthquake, a shift in power that required blood to seal it. These weren't random acts of violence. They were calculated eliminations disguised as justice. What made the tower unique wasn't just who died there, but how they died. The execution method often reflected your social status, your crime, and most importantly, how much the monarch despised you. A clean beheading, that meant you still had friends in high places. Anything else, you'd probably made a very powerful enemy. Fair warning, what you're about to learn goes far beyond anything you'll find in a typical history book. We're talking about real people who faced unimaginable terror in their final moments. People who walked those same stone corridors tourists stroll through today, knowing they'd never walk out again. The Tower of London stands today as one of Britain's most beloved tourist attractions. Millions snap photos where blood once pooled. Children play where scaffolds once stood. Gift shops sell souvenirs, meters from where history's most famous figures breathed their last. But between 1066 and 1941, this wasn't a museum. It was a fortress, a palace, a prison, an armory, a mint, a zoo, and yes, an execution ground. The tower served every function a medieval monarch could need, all wrapped up in one imposing riverside complex. Those whitewashed walls you see today, they've witnessed more English history than any other structure in the kingdom. William the Conqueror built the White Tower to intimidate London's population into submission. It worked. For nearly 1,000 years, the tower represented royal authority in its most physical form. Control it, and you controlled England. The transformation from palace to prison happened gradually. Medieval kings initially used the tower as a secure residence. Thick walls kept enemies out while the Thames provided an escape route if things went south. But those same features that made it an excellent fortress also made it a perfect prison. By the 14th century, the tower had become the Crown's preferred detention center for high-profile prisoners. Unlike common jails, the tower specialized in what we might call political prisoners. These weren't pickpockets or highway robbers. The tower's inmates had titles, lands, armies. They'd played the Game of Thrones and lost. Some were foreign princes captured in war. Others were English nobles who'd backed the wrong claimant. Many were simply people who'd somehow threatened or annoyed whoever happened to be wearing the crown. The conditions varied wildly depending on your status and wealth. Rich prisoners could rent entire apartments within the tower complex, complete with servants, fine food, and visitors. Sir Walter Raleigh famously grew tobacco in the Tower Gardens during his 13-year imprisonment. He even fathered a child there. Poor prisoners, meanwhile, found themselves chained in rat-infested dungeons where the Thames would flood at high tide. But comfortable or not, every tower prisoner lived under the same shadow. At any moment, a warrant could arrive. Guards would appear at your door. You'd be marched to Tower Green or Tower Hill, and that would be that. The tower's reputation grew with each famous execution. By Tudor times, Just hearing you were being sent to the tower could make grown men faint. The phrase "sent to the tower" became synonymous with political destruction. Even if you survived your imprisonment, and many did, the stigma followed you forever. What truly set the tower apart was its dual nature. This was where monarchs held their coronation feasts and where they eliminated their rivals. Where the crown jewels glittered in one tower while prisoners screamed under torture in another. Where royal babies were born in the same complex where royal wives lost their heads. That's the tower's real legacy, not just as a prison or execution site, but as the physical embodiment of royal power in all its glory and horror. Every stone tells two stories, one of splendor, one of suffering, both equally true, both equally British. Power in medieval England was a blood sport, and the Tower of London was its ultimate arena. Every execution carried out within its walls represented a political calculation, a message written in blood for all to see. These weren't crimes of passion or common murders being punished. This was statecraft at its most brutal. The game worked like this: threaten the crown's authority, and you threaten the entire kingdom's stability. At least that's how monarchs justified turning the tower into their personal elimination service. Whether you'd actually committed treason or simply found yourself on the wrong side of a succession crisis, the result was often the same: a walk to the scaffold, a final prayer, then nothing. Take the case of William Hastings in 1483. One morning he was Lord Chamberlain, trusted advisor to the royal family. By afternoon his head had been hacked off on a log outside the Tower Chapel. His crime? Richard III claimed Hastings was plotting against him. No trial, no evidence presented, just an accusation, an order, and an axe. Medieval justice moved fast when power was at stake. The Tower's executions followed patterns that revealed the political anxieties of each era. During the Wars of the Roses, it was all about dynastic threats. Lancastrians executed Yorkists. Yorkists executed Lancastrians. The axe swung depending on which rose currently bloomed on the throne. Noble blood meant nothing if it flowed in the wrong veins. Then came the Tudors, and the game changed. Now religion entered the equation. Under Henry VIII, you could lose your head for denying the king's supremacy over the church. Under Mary I, you might burn for embracing it. The Tower's victims during this period included bishops, monks, scholars, anyone whose beliefs threatened the current religious settlement. What made these executions particularly effective as political tools was their visibility. When Thomas More, England's former Lord Chancellor, walked to the scaffold in 1535, every educated person in Europe knew why. He'd refused to acknowledge Henry VIII's break with Rome. His death sent a clear message: choose between your conscience and your neck. The intelligence networks that fed the Tower's dungeons were surprisingly sophisticated. The Tudor monarchs employed vast spy networks. Servants reported on masters. Priests informed on parishioners. Your own family might betray you for a purse of gold or promise of advancement. Once suspicion fell on you, evidence could always be found, or manufactured. The interrogation techniques used in the Tower evolved into an art form. The rack stretched bodies until joints popped. The scavenger's daughter compressed them until ribs cracked. Iron gauntlets crushed hands to pulp. Yet many prisoners never faced physical torture. The psychological pressure often proved enough. Show them the instruments. Let them hear others screaming. Wait. Most eventually confessed to whatever story their interrogators wanted to hear. But here's what the history books often miss. Many Tower executions backfired spectacularly. Execute a popular noble, and you might create a martyr. Kill someone with powerful friends, and you'd make enemies who'd spend decades plotting revenge. The Tower's scaffold launched as many conspiracies as it ended. The scaffold on Tower Green has tasted royal blood more times than any other execution site in England. And the most famous head to roll there belonged to Anne Boleyn, a woman who went from Queen of England to condemned traitor in just 3 years. On May 19, 1536, she knelt on those wooden boards, knowing that her husband, Henry VIII, was already planning his wedding to her lady-in-waiting. The charges against her: adultery with 5 men, including her own brother. Historical records prove these accusations were fabricated, but that didn't stop the executioner's blade. Anne's final moments reveal something deeply unsettling about Tudor justice. She actually thanked Henry for choosing a French swordsman over the usual axe-wielding executioner. Why would a condemned woman express gratitude? Because she'd witnessed enough botched executions to know that a clumsy headsman could turn a quick death into prolonged butchery. Palace accounts describe her practicing how to position her neck, rehearsing her own execution like a macabre performance. She even joked with her ladies that the swordsman would have an easy job because she had a little neck. The executioner himself played a psychological game that morning. He deliberately called for his sword while standing behind Anne, causing her to turn her head. In that split second of distraction, the blade fell. Witnesses reported that her lips continued moving in prayer after her head hit the straw. Her eyes, according to one account, seemed to look about for several seconds before finally going still. Lady Jane Grey's execution 18 years later makes Anne's death look merciful by comparison. Here was a 16-year-old girl who never wanted the crown, forced onto the throne by power-hungry relatives, then abandoned when their coup failed. After just 9 days as queen, she found herself in the Tower's dungeons, waiting 8 months for the axe to fall. February 12, 1554. Tower Green again. Jane was so young and small that the executioner had to guide her hands to find the block. Blindfolded and trembling, she kept missing it, crying out, "What shall I do? Where is it?" The gathered crowd watched in horror as this teenager groped blindly for the instrument of her own death. When she finally found it, her last words were, "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit." The axe struck true, but witnesses noted something disturbing. Her body convulsed violently for nearly a minute after decapitation. One observer wrote that her hands opened and closed as if still seeking the block. Modern medical knowledge tells us these were likely just muscle spasms, but to the Tudor crowd, it looked like the desperate movements of a girl too young to die. These weren't random victims of medieval brutality. Both women died because they stood between powerful men and their ambitions. Anne's real crime? Failing to produce a male heir. Jane's transgression? Being born with royal blood that others wanted to exploit. Their executions sent a clear message. Even queens weren't safe from the Tower's judgment. The Tower claimed other notable heads too. Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, suffered perhaps the most horrific noble execution in 1541. At 67 years old, she refused to kneel at the block, declaring her innocence. The inexperienced executioner chased her around the scaffold, hacking at her head and shoulders until she finally collapsed. It took 11 blows to finish the job. Witnesses reported that the scaffold looked more like a butcher's yard than an execution ground. For the nobility of England, death itself wasn't the true punishment, it was the method that mattered. While commoners faced the grotesque spectacle of hanging, drawing, and quartering, those of gentle birth received the privilege of beheading. This distinction might seem like mercy, but the reality was far more complex than any simple hierarchy of suffering. The science behind beheading is brutally straightforward. A sharp blade traveling at sufficient speed severs the spinal cord between the third and fourth cervical vertebrae, theoretically causing instant death. The brain, suddenly deprived of oxygenated blood, should lose consciousness within seconds. That's the theory. The practice at the Tower told a different story entirely. Everything depended on the executioner's skill, the sharpness of his weapon, and the condemned person's ability to remain still. The Tower employed several headsmen over the centuries, and their competence varied wildly. The best could remove a head with surgical precision. The worst turned executions into prolonged horror shows that haunted spectators for years. Take the execution of Thomas Cromwell in 1540. Henry VIII deliberately chose an inexperienced executioner, some say a butcher's apprentice, as a final insult to his former chief minister. The first blow barely broke the skin. The second embedded the axe in Cromwell's skull without killing him. Contemporary accounts describe him trying to speak, blood bubbling from his mouth as he attempted to pray. It took 3 more strikes before his suffering ended. One witness wrote that the executioner was so incompetent that he literally hacked Lord Cromwell's head and neck to pieces. The axe itself presented unique challenges. Unlike a sword, which could slice cleanly through tissue, the axe relied on blunt force trauma combined with its blade edge. Tower records show that executioners regularly had to pause mid-execution to free their weapon from vertebrae or shoulder blades. Each failed strike meant the condemned experienced the full terror of their situation while remaining conscious. Even successful beheadings weren't as clean as history suggests. The human neck contains major arteries that, when severed, create dramatic arterial spray. Execution accounts describe blood shooting several feet into the air, drenching the scaffold, and sometimes reaching the crowd. The executioner's black hood wasn't just for anonymity. It protected him from being blinded by blood during his grim work. Then there's the disturbing question of post-decapitation consciousness. Multiple Tower executions include reports of severed heads showing signs of awareness. The Duke of Monmouth's head allegedly turned toward the crowd after separation from his body. George Boleyn's lips were seen forming words. While modern science suggests consciousness fades within 2-7 seconds after decapitation, those seconds must have felt like eternity. The executioner's block itself tells its own story. Made from solid oak and hollowed to cradle the neck, it bore the scars of hundreds of deaths. Deep grooves from missed strikes, dark stains that no amount of scrubbing could remove. Condemned prisoners often had to kneel in the blood of previous victims, adding another layer of psychological torment to their final moments. For nobles facing the block, the days before execution brought unique privileges. They could wear their finest clothes, speak final words, and distribute remembrances to the crowd. This pageantry masked a harsh truth. Even the merciful death of beheading was a calculated form of state terrorism, designed to demonstrate absolute royal power over life and death. The lucky ones got experienced executioners who took pride in their craft. They sharpened their axes obsessively, studied anatomy, and practiced on animal carcasses. A skilled headsman could sever a head so cleanly that observers reported the body remaining upright for several seconds, as if unaware of its loss. These professionals saw themselves as instruments of justice, not mere killers. But expertise couldn't eliminate the fundamental barbarity of separating a human head from its body. Not everyone who entered the Tower emerged with the relative dignity of a beheading. For those deemed truly treacherous, particularly commoners who dared challenge the crown, a far more theatrical punishment awaited. Hanging, drawing, and quartering represented the absolute pinnacle of judicial sadism, a carefully choreographed destruction of the human body designed to extend suffering far beyond what any person should endure. The process began with a deliberate subversion of a normal execution. The condemned was dragged to the gallows on a wooden hurdle, already bloodied from the cobblestones. The hanging itself was precisely calculated, not long enough to break the neck or cause unconsciousness, just sufficient to bring the victim to the edge of death. Contemporary accounts describe executioners checking pulse rates, ensuring their victims remained aware for what came next. After cutting down the barely conscious prisoner, the real horror began. The executioner made an incision from sternum to groin, carefully avoiding major arteries to prevent rapid blood loss. Internal organs were extracted while the victim watched. Father John Cornelius, executed in 1594, allegedly spoke to his executioner during his own disembowelment, asking him to spare his heart until last so he could continue praying. Whether true or embellished, such accounts revealed the medieval understanding that consciousness could persist through unimaginable trauma. The drawing phase has been widely misunderstood. Many assume it refers to the dragging to the execution site, but Tower records clarify the truth. It meant drawing out the intestines and organs, often burning them before the prisoner's eyes. The smell of one's own burning entrails, mixed with the acrid smoke from the brazier, created a sensory nightmare that transcended physical pain. Quartering came last, after death had finally claimed the victim. The body was hacked into 4 pieces. With martyrs, you'd watch the executioner lift his axe, and everything came down to the precision of a single swing. Palace records from 1541 detail how Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, suffered through what witnesses called the most bungled execution in Tower history. The executioner missed her neck entirely on the first blow, then the second. By the third attempt, chunks of shoulder and skull littered the scaffold while she was still moving. The difference between mercy and torture rested entirely in the executioner's skill. A properly executed beheading required the blade to slice cleanly between the third and fourth cervical vertebrae, severing the spinal cord instantly. Death would follow within 2 to 3 seconds as blood pressure to the brain plummeted. Royal physicians documented that victims showed no voluntary movement after a clean cut, just reflexive muscle spasms that witnesses often mistook for consciousness. Anne Boleyn understood this brutal mathematics. She specifically requested a French swordsman because English axemen had a reputation for needing multiple strikes. The sword's sweeping motion generated more speed than a downward axe blow, increasing the chances of a clean cut. Historical medical texts confirm her calculation was correct. A sword traveling at sufficient velocity could slice through neck tissue and bone in under a second. The hanging portion of drawing and quartering operated on entirely different principles. Executioners deliberately used a short drop that wouldn't break the neck. Instead, victims slowly strangled as their own body weight compressed the carotid arteries. Medical examinations from the period describe how faces turned purple, eyes bulged with burst blood vessels, and bodily functions released as oxygen deprivation set in. Full unconsciousness took between 4 and 7 minutes, though movement could continue for up to 15. The drawing stage began, while victims retained consciousness. Executioners made an incision from sternum to groin, then methodically removed intestines and organs. Contemporary medical understanding shows the human body can remain aware for several minutes even with massive blood loss, as long as the heart and brain remain intact. Victims watched their own disembowelment until blood loss finally induced shock. Quartering required specific anatomical knowledge. Executioners targeted the major joints, shoulders and hips, where ligaments offered less resistance than solid bone. They used cleavers designed for the purpose, heavy enough to separate limbs with minimal repeated blows. Medical texts note that severing at the joint minimized bone splintering, which executioners preferred because it made displaying body parts easier. The Tower's execution records reveal a disturbing pattern. Skilled executioners commanded premium fees precisely because their expertise meant the difference between quick death and extended agony. By 1685, the position of king's executioner included detailed training in anatomy, passed from master to apprentice through generations. Charles Sanson, who would later execute Louis XVI in France, studied manuscripts describing Tower executions to perfect his technique. His notes describe practicing on pig carcasses to understand exactly how much force different bones required, which angle best exposed the vertebrae, and where blood vessels lay closest to the surface. This medical precision transformed state murder into something resembling surgical procedure, if surgery's goal was death rather than healing. The Spanish ambassador's secretary left us one of the most detailed eyewitness accounts from inside the Tower walls. Writing about George Boleyn's execution in 1536, he describes how the condemned man's head jumped clean from his shoulders and rolled almost to where I stood, the eyes still moving as if looking for his body. Multiple witnesses corroborated this disturbing detail, severed heads displaying what appeared to be conscious movement for several seconds after separation. Lady Jane Grey's execution offers perhaps the most haunting first-hand testimony. Her lady-in-waiting recorded how the 17-year-old fumbled blindfolded on the scaffold, crying out, "What shall I do? Where is it?" as she searched for the block. Witnesses noted she repeated, "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit," 3 times before the axe fell. The blow was clean, but attendees described how her lips continued moving in prayer even after her head rolled away. The execution of Thomas Cromwell in 1540 provides a masterclass in how quickly noble death could descend into butchery. The chronicler Edward Hall witnessed how the hangman struck off his head at one stroke, but the blow was so badly aimed that it took off the back of his skull while his face remained attached. 3 more blows were required while Cromwell's body convulsed on the scaffold. Spectators close enough to see reported his fingers clenching and unclenching throughout the ordeal. Drawing and quartering produced even more nightmarish accounts. The Jesuit priest Edmund Campion's execution in 1581 was witnessed by hundreds at Tyburn before his remains were displayed at the Tower. One observer wrote how Campion remained conscious through the hanging, revived during the disemboweling, and spoke Latin prayers while his entrails were burned before him. The crowd watched him track the movement of his own organs being thrown into the fire. Perhaps no account captures the visceral reality better than the execution of the Scottish rebel William Wallace in 1305. Though executed at Smithfield, his quarters were displayed on the tower's walls. An English chronicler documented how Wallace did look upon his own bowels as the executioner drew them forth, and remained aware enough to cry out when his genitals were severed and cast into the flames. The writer notes Wallace's eyes followed each piece of his body as it was removed. Tower guards themselves left disturbing testimonies. One recorded how after the Jacobite Lord Derwentwater's beheading in 1716, his body leaped up 3 times from the scaffold boards with such violence that the executioner's assistants struggled to hold it down. Another guard's journal from 1746 describes collecting Charles Radcliffe's head, noting warm blood still pumped from the neck stump a full minute after separation. These weren't distant observations. Witnesses stood close enough to be splattered with blood, to smell the released bowels, to hear the wet sounds of separation. Mary, Queen of Scots' execution generated multiple detailed accounts because numerous officials attended. They describe her lips moving in prayer for a full 15 seconds after decapitation, her gray hair revealing itself as a wig when her head was lifted, and most disturbingly, her small dog emerging from under her skirts to lap at the pooling blood. The most clinical account comes from the physician present at the Duke of Monmouth's execution in 1685. He documented how the first blow merely gashed the neck, the second missed entirely, and by the 5th unsuccessful attempt, the executioner threw down his axe, declaring he could not continue. Officials forced him to finish with a knife while Monmouth's body writhed on the block. The physician noted the Duke's eyes remained open and tracking movement throughout most of this ordeal, finally glazing only as the knife severed the final tendons. Each execution at the Tower generated ripple effects through London society that lasted years. The beheading of Anne Boleyn transformed public opinion almost overnight. Contemporary letters describe crowds who came to jeer instead falling silent as she spoke from the scaffold, praising the king who ordered her death. Within weeks, ballads appeared in taverns calling her a martyred queen. Merchants reported that miniature portraits of Anne sold faster than they could paint them, hidden in lockets by those who dared not speak their sympathy openly. Thomas More's execution in 1535 created an even more complex public response. Here stood the former Lord Chancellor, author of Utopia, reduced to a traitor's death for refusing to acknowledge Henry VIII's supremacy over the Church. Witnesses reported that when More joked with his executioner, "Help me up, I can get down by myself," nervous laughter rippled through the crowd before transforming into something resembling collective shame. The Spanish ambassador noted that London fell strangely quiet for days afterward. The execution of the Countess of Salisbury in 1541 provoked outright horror rather than political calculation. This 67-year-old woman, chased around the scaffold by an incompetent executioner, shattered the illusion of dignified state justice. Parliament records show that even Henry VIII's supporters struggled to defend the spectacle. One courtier wrote that watching the old lady hacked to pieces like a training dummy made him physically ill for weeks. Drawing and quartering generated different responses entirely. When the Babington plotters met their fate in 1586, Elizabeth I specifically ordered maximum suffering for these would-be assassins. The crowd initially cheered as the first conspirator was cut down from the gallows while still conscious. Those cheers died when the disemboweling began. By the time the executioner reached the third man, spectators were vomiting and fleeing. Elizabeth, receiving reports of the crowd's reaction, ordered the remaining conspirators be hanged until dead before butchering, not from mercy, but because public revulsion threatened to generate sympathy for the condemned. The gunpowder plot executions of 1606 revealed how state brutality could backfire spectacularly. Guy Fawkes, weakened by torture, had to be helped up the ladder to the noose. When he jumped to break his own neck and avoid the full punishment, You've been fed lies about the Tower of London your entire life. Those tourist guides spinning tales of daily beheadings and torture chambers running around the clock? Complete fabrication. The Tower wasn't some medieval slaughterhouse churning out corpses every sunrise. Historical records reveal something far more calculated and terrifying. Only around 112 documented executions happened within the Tower's walls over 400 years. That's fewer than one death every 3 years. The real horror wasn't the frequency, it was the precision. Take Anne Boleyn. Every schoolchild knows she was beheaded for witchcraft, right? Wrong. Not a single official charge mentioned sorcery. The actual indictment accused her of adultery with 5 men, including her own brother George. Modern historians have torn these charges apart piece by piece. The dates don't match up. On several occasions when she allegedly committed these acts, court records prove she was hundreds of miles away, heavily pregnant, or recovering from childbirth. Henry VIII didn't need witchcraft nonsense. He had something far more effective, a rigged jury of 26 peers who understood exactly what verdict the king expected. Every single one voted guilty. Not because they believed the charges, but because they valued their own necks. Here's what the tour guides won't tell you. Most Tower prisoners never faced execution at all. For every dramatic beheading, hundreds simply rotted in cells for years before quiet releases or deaths from disease. The Tower held everyone from counterfeiters to religious dissidents, and the vast majority walked out alive, eventually. This wasn't some death factory. It was a carefully managed tool of state terror, where the threat of execution accomplished more than actual bloodshed ever could. The myths multiply with each retelling. Lady Jane Grey wasn't some innocent teenager stumbling blindfolded around the scaffold searching for the block. Contemporary accounts describe a composed young woman who placed her own head on the block with steady hands. She'd watched other executions. She knew exactly what to do. The famous painting showing her groping helplessly? Pure Victorian melodrama painted 280 years after her death. Even the torture stories crumble under scrutiny. Yes, the rack existed. Yes, prisoners endured questioning under duress. But systematic torture wasn't the Tower's primary function. Most interrogations involved simple imprisonment and psychological pressure. Why break bodies when breaking spirits proved far more effective? The state wanted confessions that would hold up in court, not incoherent ramblings from shattered victims. The numbers tell the real story. Out of thousands who passed through the Tower's gates as prisoners, fewer than 50 faced torture according to official records. The rack saw more dust than blood. Those sprawling torture chambers packed with iron maidens and elaborate devices? They never existed. The actual torture equipment filled a single small room. Most prisoners faced nothing worse than damp cells and terrible food, which, granted, could be torture enough in 16th century London. The historical records themselves fuel endless scholarly warfare. How many executions really occurred? Depends who's counting and what they're counting. Those 112 executions within the Tower walls don't include the hundreds more on Tower Hill just outside. Some historians argue certain deaths were murders disguised as natural causes. Others point to executions that left no paper trail because they were too politically sensitive to document. Take the princes in the Tower. Young Edward V and his brother Richard vanished in 1483, presumably murdered, but by whom? Traditional history blamed their uncle Richard III, who conveniently became king after their disappearance. Modern revisionists finger Henry VII, who had just as much motive and better opportunity. The bones found under a Tower staircase in 1674 might be theirs, or they might belong to anyone from any century. DNA testing could solve it, but the Queen refuses to allow the remains to be disturbed. Every Tower execution story splits into competing versions. Was Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, really chased around the scaffold by an inexperienced executioner while she refused to submit? One account says yes. Another describes a dignified death with a single stroke. The Spanish ambassador wrote one version, the imperial ambassador another. Both had political agendas. Both probably lied. Even Anne Boleyn's execution sparks debate. Did Henry really import a French swordsman out of mercy, ensuring a cleaner death than an axe would provide? Or was it calculated theater, making her execution seem more like a judicial proceeding than common murder? The swordsman received 100 crowns, over 20 times a typical executioner's fee. That money trail suggests something beyond simple mercy. The Tower's execution records themselves can't be trusted. Some were altered years later to support new political narratives. Others vanished during convenient fires or reformations. We know Thomas Cromwell was executed on July 28, 1540, but accounts of his final words vary wildly. Did he proclaim loyalty to the king, confess to heresy, deny all charges? Each version served someone's agenda. modern forensics occasionally clarifies old mysteries while creating new ones. When researchers examined the supposed burial site of Anne Boleyn in the Tower's chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, they found a confusion of bones from multiple bodies. The Victorians had already disturbed the site during renovations, mixing remains and losing markers. We know Anne lies somewhere beneath that chapel floor, but exactly where and alongside whom remains guesswork. The frustrating truth: time has swallowed too much evidence. For every documented execution, rumors suggest 3 more that left no trace. Political prisoners who entered the tower and simply disappeared, quiet strangulations in cells, bodies disposed of in the Thames. The Tower of London's real legacy isn't the executions we know about, it's all the deaths we'll never be able to prove or disprove. Behind those stone walls, the state perfected the art of strategic silence. The myths grew because the truth was carefully, deliberately erased. And maybe that's the most terrifying fact of all.